Hey folks, welcome back to the second half of the DarkHorse Podcast live stream number 7. We are going to answer your super chat questions. I am sitting with Dr. Heather Hying. I am going to do a better job, I promise, of speaking into the microphone. It's harder than it looks. All right.
All right. Without further ado, we are going to embark on these questions. Question number 1. Looking at the toilet paper hoarding from an evolutionary standpoint, do you believe gender differences could be playing a role, and would men or women be the more likely culprit?
Playing a role, good one. Roll of toilet paper.
It's spelled differently.
Oh, it's spelled differently. You spellers are all alike.
Yeah.
What do you think? You want to address that?
I think women are more likely to be hoarding toilet paper. I'm not sure I love the term hoarding. I don't know if we've talked about this on the live stream, but the idea of planning ahead and having a back supply of things that you need is not inherently hoarding. If you never did it before and you're panicking, maybe that looks like hoarding. But if you always tend to have a lot of something around, I'm not sure that should be qualified as hoarding. But put that aside. Women in general are more likely to be putting stuff away and saving and planning for later situations, I think. And also women use toilet paper more women use toilet paper every time they use the bathroom, I think. Whereas men only use toilet paper when they're actually sitting down on the toilet.
So I think it's safe to say women are probably more likely to be stockpiling toilet paper, and men are more likely to be left scratching their heads wondering why it doesn't drop from the sky like normal.
Perhaps, yes.
Yes, I would say I find the whole toilet paper phenomenon curious because as much as I get that people are stocking up even on stuff that's not absolutely essential, I think this is more a reflection of human insecurities than it is a response to the particular crisis in question. This could get kind of biological in nature, but I gotta say, if the toilet paper, some people, wise people, aren't using toilet paper to begin with. They've moved on to some version of a bidet that's healthier for the body. And if the hot water continues to run, toilet paper isn't your only go-to move. So
a whole lot of the world doesn't use toilet paper, and this, we cannot continue to spend so much time on the first question and then run out of time at the end. But back when I'm at Madagascar, I'd embark on these 5-month field seasons and would have to plan out what am I going to need for 5 months. And one of the things was, how much does a person and her field assistant, how much toilet paper does one person and their field assistant, or for the field season you were with me on, 2 people and the field assistant, use in 5 months? Because at that point anyway, there was literally no possibility of buying toilet paper anywhere in Madagascar. It's just not what they used. And it's such a desperately poor country that it was not going to be a luxury item that started to be used. It's not that people don't clean their butts. They do so. They just don't do it with paper.
They do it some other way. Yes. Yeah. In Madagascar, even the concept of toilet was a bit foreign in most locations.
A bit.
But all right, let's move on.
All right. So we have several questions from Echo, which, thank you, I now know how to pronounce your name. Assume that virus X has become innocuous in a rat species. Can it cause radical diet change, for instance? If all pandas who fed on virus-laden rats die and only those able to eat bamboo survive? You want to take that one?
Yeah. So first of all, when you say innocuous, we presume that you mean that it has become harmless to the creature. That is not consistent with it radically changing diet, because presumably the animal that would be infected has a diet choice that is honed based on whatever the opportunity cost of the various foodstuffs that are available are. So if the virus alters what the animal is feeding on, it's moving away from whatever selection had chosen as the right diet for that habitat. So those two things are a little bit inconsistent. But your point about could a virus alter the food preferences of an animal, yes, this is readily possible. And I would just say that if we look at toxoplasmosis in rodents, which is a parasite that alters the behavior of rodents such that they are more likely to be ingested by cats, cats being the place where the pathogen reproduces, we see exactly this kind of alteration. And it's not the only case. There are many places where pathogens alter behavior to increase the likelihood of their being passed on. Not all of them match that model you propose, but enough things are close that, yeah, it's readily possible.
And a follow-up here, could awareness of the possibility of catching a potential virus be one of the reasons why some animals don't like the company of other species? Could that be one more reason than food to defend territory? The question about defending territory is particularly interesting. I think yes, potentially.
Yeah, I would say it's certainly true that to the extent that viruses or any other pathogen leaping between species carries a cost, that it will schedule how reluctant creatures are to interact. And I will also say that I've seen, as a mammologist, I've seen ectoparasites attempt to abandon a sinking mammal, where an animal dies and it's got fleas, and those fleas are now in a desperate race to find some other animal. So from the point of view of anything that would mess with that carcass, like a scavenger, there is going to be a cost-benefit analysis. Is the meat worth the ectoparasites? Or, if it's a raptor, maybe the ectoparasites aren't very well adapted to jump to the raptor, so it might be a better food item for a bird than another mammal, for example.
I will say, I think actually that the default assumption here may be flipped, that organisms are not basally, that is primitively, but we tend to try not to use that word in evolutionary biology. We talk about the basal state, the earliest state. Organisms tend to be solitary and evolve sociality rather than are social and evolve away from sociality. Not that that doesn't happen, but that if the default assumption is one of being relatively solitary, we tend to end up trying to explain why sociality evolves rather than why solitariness evolves. That said, we know, for instance, that in cases of, migrating shorebirds who end up in these mass nesting colonies in Alaska and the Pacific coast of Canada, that their nests become, it's not virus, but another pathogen. They have these ectoparasites that their nests become filled with, such that they have a limited time that they are going to be in those nests. So they are social, but in a temporally restricted way. So they're sort of mass aggregations, and then once their broods are reared and they're migrating again, they tend to disaggregate.
Yes. All right.
Another question so there's 4 questions here from Echo. Are animals aware of more things than we assume? Yes.
Depends who you are and what you assume.
Yes, but they are aware of things that probably some animals are capable of inferring information about the world that we have very little concept of.
So I'll pull in both directions on this one. Mm-hmm. Animals are frequently aware of things that you don't expect them to be aware of. On the other hand, aware and conscious are 2 different things. And at some point we will talk about consciousness, but I would just say that there is next to no reason to hypothesize consciousness in a great many organisms that behave in a beautifully interactive way. In other words, consciousness, that is subjective experience, is costly and not necessarily beneficial with respect to accomplishing many of the beautiful things that animals do. So don't leap to the assumption that just because an animal behaves in a way that a conscious animal might, that it is inherently conscious. In many cases, it will almost certainly turn out not to be the case.
Oh, that's so interesting. I read aware. I immediately synonymized that with sensory inputs. What kinds of sensory inputs do other animals have that we either don't have in as high a form? Our sense of smell is much reduced compared to the other mammals, or that we don't appear to have at all, things like electrosensory perception.
Yeah, and I would just say the way to think about this is if you look up at the canopy of a forest, you will see that the trees actually have interlaced with each other, that they don't spend a lot of time overlapping, and they really don't spend a lot of time crashing into each other, right? They've sort of navigated the space in some way. That suggests a kind of awareness, and we know it has nothing to do with a conscious awareness, subjective experience, etc. It's a kind of passive awareness, but elegant.
Good. And final question from Echo. Bret, would people who look younger than their age have longer telomeres? Any studies on different ethnicities' telomere length?
Yeah. I would be a little bit cautious about people who look younger. That is too broad. But yes, you will find any tissue that has a below average level of damage at a given age will leave that individual younger in that tissue. That can be your liver, it can be your skin. We know a lot about how this works in skin with collagen matrix. But basically, rule of thumb would be that if a tissue looks younger, and I would say the gold standard would be under a microscope, if the tissue looks really well organized like it came from a young animal, it probably is chronologically younger by virtue of having gone through fewer cell divisions to get where it is. And, we also, empirically, I would just say, there's a lot of truth to the fact that, 60 is the new 40. Right? There's a way in which our lives just do so much less damage than our immediate ancestors, because, we do certain kinds of damage sitting at a desk or whatever, but by and large, our lives are physically a lot easier than they were even a century ago. And so hard lives wear down your replicative capacity rapidly, and to the extent that you're spared that, you do retain youth longer, which is desirable. This is part of why I'm so troubled by the campaign to end human aging, is that actually, if we got over that, we know a ton about how to keep you healthy longer, and the returns on research investments that go towards how do we slow the aging process, not by magic, but by, making life better and healthier, those returns are great. And we are ignoring them, gambling on something that I think will never come to pass, which is actually correcting the aging problem in the living organism without disrupting its ability to function.
Good. I don't know anything about this next question, Bret. So I'm going to read it, although I know that I don't have the one guy's name pronounced correctly. London Real had the video removed, banned from LinkedIn, and more after the interview with David Icke on 5G, rights and freedom issues. Wackos are not targeted. What do you guys see there? So this is broadly a question about 5G, but I don't know the particular references he's making.
Yeah, and I'm not too far ahead of you. I'm sort of aware that there is a story, but I couldn't even tell you what it is. So maybe this is something, somehow we need a better mechanism for remembering what we've said we're going to look into. I know I dropped the ball on a couple from
Zach,
the last
I don't know
one.
if you can highlight that line in the super chat Google thing. Great. All right. Could viruses have evolved some mechanism to self-regulate their rate of replication to maximize transmission and the time the host keeps transmitting? Isn't it probable in viruses like COVID-19, like SARS-CoV-2?
Yep. I would say absolutely.
Yep.
You would expect viruses to naturally evolve to regulate their rate for maximum levels of transmission. Sometimes that will be produce as many as possible, right? So inside of a cell that's been infected, that might even be the rule. But how much transmission to a new host is accomplished by invading new tissue within an already infected host is an interesting question. And the more transmission between cells, the more compromised the host is going to be. So as we've talked about before, in the case of many, but not all pathogens, they benefit from not making you so sick that you can't move around and spread them. So they will evolve in the direction of regulating their pathogenicity within the host to leave you on your feet.
And the more specialized the transmission maximizing between hosts of the same species, the less likely probably that the virus will be able to jump species, right? So the more specialized your virus is, the less likely we're going to see it if it started out in a bat or a pangolin or a civet or a camel or whatever. Whereas these more generalized transmission vectors are the ones that we're going to see. And part of probably why we see something that looks kind of dysregulated on the part of the virus right now. I think most people have dropped the expectation now that this will clearly follow the seasonal pattern and we'll see less of it in the North American summer, because there doesn't seem to be any evidence of that from the Southern Hemisphere summer and from more tropical climes. But really this is about, as we've talked about earlier, this is about this particular virus being completely new to the human host. It's not that the virus is new to life on this planet, but it's very new to its relationship with us.
Yeah, it has no experience with us, and so even if it's well regulated for its original bat host, it's not clear that it even has the signals to follow the same pattern
Right.
in a human.
Yeah.
So I would say in the case of COVID-19, we're in some sense waiting for it to figure out what its interests are. I do expect some decrease in the transmissibility from a number of different sources. One is what we talked about last time, UV light being an effective killer of the thing. So to the extent that it's brighter and there are more hours of daylight, that suggests a positivity that has nothing to do with the cyclic pattern of the pathogen itself. And also, if it is true that we are seeing, and again, there's a couple of studies that say that we're seeing something like 0.5% to 1% of the total infected population are showing up on reports of COVID-19 cases. If that holds from the Scottish data and elsewhere, then what it suggests is potentially a sizable fraction of the population growing immune over time without being symptomatic, and that also predicts something that has nothing to do with seasonality, but as we head towards the northern summer, we're also heading towards greater herd immunity.
Right. Which is what we want.
Yep.
That's the best outcome. Can you recommend some books from any of the vast branches of biology? I left the question somewhat vague to give more room for interpretation. We will have recommended reading associated with the book that we are writing, but I guess I can do 3 right off the top of my head. Selfish Gene by Richard Dawkins is from 1976. Is still the classic. It's a little dated, but could use an update, but it's excellent. Mother Nature by Sarah Blaffer Hrdy is an extraordinary investigation of the evolution of not just parenting and mothering, but sex and gender more broadly. And Baboon Metaphysics by Cheney and Seyfarth, a married couple who worked on, in the case of this book, baboons in the Okavango Delta of Botswana. And they looked into to what degree baboons have things like theory of mind and are able to interpret, to realize not just that other beings exist, but that they have different understandings about the universe than they do.
Yep. Maybe I'll add a couple others.
Sure.
Guns, Germs, and Steel. That's an awfully good one from the point of view of understanding how biology and humanity interface. And just for fun, there's a great book that you and I have taught from called Tropical Nature,
Oh, yeah.
which if you want to get a handle on how things are different in the tropics, it's a great place to start. It's a really good book.
And when this lockdown is lifted and people are able to travel again, it is the book that we recommend for people going to the tropics and actually, going to explore tropical nature. You want this book in your hands, especially if it's the neotropics.
Yeah, in fact, I would go so far as to say it is essential reading. So Amazon should send it to you even if you're in Michigan.
Yes, because you heard it here first from tropical biologists.
There you go.
There it is.
And we would know.
We would know. Did the use of ancient psychotropic plants by early hominids cause a genetic disposition to addiction? Or are social constructs a greater actor in this? I see no reason to imagine a genetic disposition, but
I'm not going to blame psychotropic plants or early hominids. For one thing, I don't think either one of them would listen to us. But I will say we are coming to understand over time that the model of addiction is more complex than many people have thought and not built of the stuff that we usually assume. So what Heather and I have come to understand from years of thinking about these things is that boredom is a much greater contributor to addiction than anything else. Even these predispositions that people genetically have basically function when you don't have a better choice. So,
And there's a rat study, I think, that bears this out, right? That I think it's rats. That you offer them, and I don't remember, it's coke or meth or one of these powder drugs. You offer it to them in a cage, bereft of anything to do, and of course they become addicted. And you enrich their lives with things that enrich the lives of rats. I don't know if that's wheels to run in or television to watch. I have no idea. I don't remember. But they'll try it. They'll try the lever and take some, but they don't become addicted at nearly as high rates.
yep. So a rat study bears it out. Probably a bear study would rat it out. But,
Absolutely.
You wouldn't want to give this stuff to bears for a lot of reasons.
Especially not meth. No. Any thoughts on the three-toed skink regarding its ambiparity? Here's the CNN article. So we were able to look at one and only one of these questions in advance, and we both saw that because skinks, right?
Why would you tell them we looked it up? It's so much cooler to just pretend that we happen to know this particular study.
So neither of us did. And I only looked at the CNN article, so we did not have time to look at the paper that it was based on. But it seems that there is a skink that was both oviparous and viviparous, meaning that an individual both laid eggs and gave live birth. And that is not supposed to happen, right? That in general, species, I think what the study said was that it laid eggs and it gave live birth sort of within the confines of what would normally be expected in a single pregnancy. But there are snake species that do this. There are snake species that, depending on where they are in their range, they will sometimes be viviparous, that is giving live birth, and sometimes be oviparous. I don't think it's within a single individual, although it's harder. These are very nasty and aggressive African snakes that I'm thinking of. I can't remember the species. There are a couple of them. But it begs the question. It's amazing if individuals can do both, but why in general? The question is, why lay eggs versus why give birth? Egg laying is the basal state, to return to that terminology, that viviparity evolves later than egg laying. And there are reversals. You can go back to oviparity from viviparity. And there's also this intermediate state called ovoviviparity, where you have eggs inside of you that hatch and then
hatch. I was going to ask if that was the mechanism here.
Yeah, so it may well be, and at least the CNN article didn't say. But just think about, under what circumstances you would want, if you're having kids, if you're pursuing the thing that evolution has told you to pursue, under what circumstances is it better to have a clutch of eggs that's totally defenseless, but which you can leave behind and travel to get food without the burden of being weighed down by the eggs?
Yep.
Or you want all of your brood on you at all times, but whenever you go out, you're full of your kids and you are suffering the greater weight. You're probably more susceptible to predation, all of that. So, and then there are also differences around whether or not the sex of your offspring is determined by chromosomes or by environmental measures. And you basically, if you're going to be viviparous, you're going to need to have chromosomal sex determinations. There's all of these interesting factors here.
I'm going to go the other way and say that this is actually a totally expected thing. What's not expected is that you will see it. That basically the fact of species that do both things, depending upon where in their range they are, and the fact that over time this characteristic changes, predicts that individuals will find themselves somewhere in between some fraction of the time, and then we just almost never see it.
But wouldn't your prediction be that it's almost certainly ovoviviparity then? Since viviparity requires so many distinct anatomical and physiological adaptations.
Well,
right? There are like 4 different phenotypes of placentas within placental mammals, but all of them have not just a remarkable number of circulatory, respiratory, neurological distinctions that then also have genetic distinctions. Whereas ovoviviparity, okay, I've got eggs. Do I lay the eggs or do I let the thing hatch out inside of me and then give birth? Like that seems like a pretty
easy one to get past. But the real question I would say is, if you looked across the phylogeny of snakes, if this pattern is distributed such that we know it has evolved many times. It could be a facultative thing where the structures are already latent in the genome,
Yeah,
ready to
actually,
be expressed.
I have just the paper for you. It's it's cool. For people like us, you can map the ovoviviparity onto the snake phylogeny.
Nice. We just lost almost everybody.
I know.
But
Okay. If an effective treatment or vaccine is not discovered before leaving quarantine, have our actions delayed rather than prevented COVID-19 deaths? No. I mean, both.
both, yeah.
Yeah, both. But rather than no, our actions will have delayed some deaths, but they also prevented some because there will be greater herd immunity. The virus, presumably, and this is a guess, but based on other viruses, will be evolving towards lesser virulence over time. And the healthcare professionals are learning better ways to treat. So, you say effective treatment or vaccine. I think, we have been skeptical of the plan that it's only it's a vaccine or nothing. But there are so many different avenues by which we are trying to approach this that I would say, even so, even if we have no vaccine and just treatments that seem to work in places and not in others, that the quarantine will have, yes, delayed some deaths, but also have prevented others.
I would add to this, there's this lurking parameter that I think we don't know how to think about yet, which is low levels of exposure causing non-symptomatic cases that then generate immunity. And we don't know how many of these we are generating. It is possible that I have been through this, that you got sick with COVID-19 back in February, and that I had an asymptomatic case. We actually, a friend is sending us some tests, and we may know more about whether or not this is what happened to us.
Serology tests.
But in any case, many things are possible, including that what we are doing, given the density-dependent evidence that lower exposure levels result in less serious cases, and that there are many non-symptomatic cases, slowing this down may actually be producing the effect of a vaccine without us having invented a vaccine. So I think there are lots of ways in which this is actually moving in the right direction, and as much as I think much of this has been botched at the governmental level, the population has actually risen to the challenge surprisingly well, and even absent the silver bullet, this could work out pretty well
We may
in
end
the
up
end.
with an endogenous biological vaccine created through behavioral modification rather than in a lab.
Yep.
On the 5th podcast, you discussed the low success rate of respirators. I think we were talking about ventilators particularly. Hypothesizing COVID-19 is hungry for oxygen, somehow attacking hemoglobin. If that is the case, would blood doping be a treatment?
This is actively being thought about and discussed in medical circles, and I think we need to leave it to them to navigate that. But I think the evidence for hypoxia as a primary driver here is less secure than it was. There's been more people have looked into it, and it doesn't look that way. On the other hand, the evidence that ventilators, that physical mechanical ventilation is not highly effective, that basically it becomes necessary as people face these cytokine storms at the end of very serious cases. I should come back to cytokine storm maybe a little bit later. But as people face these dire consequences at the end of one of these very bad cases of COVID-19, the ventilators become necessary, but lots of people don't live to get off the ventilator. So I think that's where we are. Blood doping is a possibility. We've talked about whether or not it carries immunity factors if it's taken from people who have had an exposure and recovered from it, or whether or not it just simply carries increased capacity to have oxygen in the blood. Either way could be viable. But yes, there's a lot to be understood there.
Will COVID-19 prove to be as cataclysmic for academia as it is for other domains, exposing academia's major structural weaknesses and inability to adapt?
We can hope.
Yes. My answer was not in response to you.
No.
It was in response to the question. Yes, I think it will. I think especially the liberal arts colleges are suffering greatly, and maybe some of the chickens have come home to roost.
Yeah, and there are a lot of chickens in academia. I've encountered quite a number myself. I would, I would say that.
Naming those chickens.
Oh, we could do a whole live stream about the chickens in academia, but the weaknesses in academia are being revealed. That is a hopeful thing if it allows what has been trapped inside of academia to either upgrade the institution so that the vital things that academia has traditionally been in charge of get done better, or that those things find a new home. Either way, we cannot have science trapped inside of an institution that can't figure out, for example, that men and women are actually two different things. Right? You just can't have an institution in charge of the one if it's confused about the other, for example.
This is Pamela Olson again, who ends her question by asking us to hold hands and smile again. So we're going to do that.
All right.
Hi.
Hello.
Hi there. She gives a link, which we can't access right here, but says that it says 91% of deaths are over 55 years old. 28.5% are over 85. The WHO site says only 1% of deaths do not have a comorbid disease.
Yep.
Shouldn't quarantine be targeted? I think there's a really good argument for this, and I think with widespread serology testing, it becomes an excellent argument that once we know, especially including who has already been exposed, the big if there being that we are assuming that if you've been exposed and have recovered that you cannot be infected again, at least right away, that then doing targeted quarantine would seem to be a very good intermediate stage that would not be putting so many people at risk of economic disaster.
I would add to this. So the reason it's not a simple question is because even if the people who are dying are older, and therefore you could potentially free younger people to go about their business, those younger people may be circulating things that then reach those older people. And so this is why I raised the question before about effectively, I think the academic term is senilicide. If we are effectively taking old people and leaving them to the wolves, that's presumably not something we want to do. And so keeping those people safe may involve a general quarantine. But the other thing, I unfortunately did not have time to fully digest it, but I read the beginnings of a very interesting article written by one of the founders of Instagram, Kevin, whose last name escapes me. Other people will know it. But anyway, he was arguing for a metric, which was, I believe, R sub T, which would allow you to compare different methods of quarantining for their effectiveness at reducing the spread of the disease, and thereby, in essence, we could figure out how is it that we could liberate people who are less endangered by this and not put those who are in danger at greater risk, et cetera. So better metrics and, as you've been saying since moment one, much higher rates of testing. Those are absolutely necessary.
Yeah, and some of the changes we've seen with regard to the quarantine could persist. I think it's pretty widespread at this point, at least in the U.S., and I suspect at least some places elsewhere as well, that grocery stores, for instance, are now starting out their day by having an hour for only elderly and other maybe immunocompromised people. And sure, it's less convenient for those of us who prefer to shop first thing in the morning, but it makes a lot of sense. And those sorts of things could continue on for a very long time, while perhaps freeing the rest of us in some greater ways. Next question. Universities are announcing austerity cuts that impact key instructors. What models would allow those fleeing these colleges to claim emerging online learning terrain outside a university system?
If you build it, they will come.
Yeah.
So
I think that's right. That's not a model, but sorry, go on.
Well, I mean, what we need is for the gatekeeping to be ended by this situation or something else, so that those who can deliver the goods without the huge overhead of the massive administrations and other absurdities that go along with modern colleges and universities, that those people are liberated to deliver the educational goods and to discover how to do it outside of that system.
I guess I would also say that although I know what's going on at a few schools, I don't know more widely. And my assumption is that because it's so much easier to cut non-tenured faculty, adjuncts, and non-tenured faculty, and even people on tenured track but without tenure yet, that those are the people who are being cut first, and those are the people, of course, who were exactly doing almost all the teaching. So one effect that we may see here is that you have higher ed becoming more and more a bastion for research, and you know what has been clear to undergraduates at big universities for a very long time is that for the most part, the big name academics either never show up in classrooms, or if they do, they certainly don't have time to actually think about teaching or to engage with undergraduates. So this separation of education from research, of scholarship from education, is a problem, and I think this will put that in even starker relief. But to the degree that the people who are being let go from their higher ed jobs were primarily in educational roles rather than research roles, they may be better positioned to figure out how to teach online than if someone with 40 years of NIH grants but no experience in the classroom were suddenly unable to get grants and lost his hard money position at an R1.
But we have a situation in which a visionary needs to figure out how to take the people who are gifted with respect to teaching, to compile them, get them paid, give them a path forward in a career that makes sense and can feed a family, and that can actually deliver something to students that is not only enriching to them, but also is recognized by the outside world as valid. You know, part of this comes down to the fact that you've got a stranglehold on education that comes from the fact that only these institutions are licensed to give you a credential that's worth anything. And so lots of people are going to these institutions not because they believe in them, but because that's where the credential comes from that then is the gateway to a job. And so somebody has to figure out how to break the stranglehold. And, you know, this is one of the places where those who are in love with the idea of economic competition are just absolutely right, which is if the universities had to compete head-to-head with something on the outside that delivered higher quality educational goods that were equally valid in the marketplace for careers, the universities would get better. It is the fact that they have an effective monopoly through accreditation and other mechanisms that has made them so feeble.
A bit off topic, but if you haven't seen Richard Linklater's movie Waking Life, I highly recommend it. Okay. Is there a hashtag we can use to tweet you possible topics for your podcast? We haven't.
We should do that.
Okay, but we aren't going to figure that out right now.
Yeah.
Okay.
You can try DarkHorse Podcast. Try that. Or DarkHorse Suggestions.
Something like that.
I don't think we should do this live.
Yeah, let's not do it live.
But you want to note that, Zachary? Thank you. And then this is another question. Okay, it's blocked. I can't see it. About this David Icky interview, making outlandish claims. This one about SARS-CoV-2 being a hoax with evidence. So I think two of our questions have come at that from different angles, and we don't know enough about it to assess. Next one, octopodes, octopi, or octopussies. I think that we should actually defer to Toby, our younger son, on this, who is a master of creating plural names for animals, such as heese for horse, and I can't actually remember any more at the moment.
Feeks.
Feeks?
Multiple foxes.
Feeks, obviously. Feeks.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I believe I got schooled in my own class that I insisted that octopi was correct and octopuses is also correct.
Oh, they're both correct.
Yeah,
Okay.
that's what I came to understand years ago.
Fair enough. Could the left-right political spectrum have evolutionary origins dating as far back as the early mammals, 65 million years ago? I'm wondering if the curiosity-fear axis could have evolved into the left-right axis we see today. So I'm going to let you take that, but I'm going to first just correct. Mammals actually didn't originate at the KT boundary when the meteor hit at Chicxulub in sort of modern Yucatan. And in fact, there are good phylogenetic models that suggest that there have been mammals around for 200 million years. But it's not clear if all of the current clades, including primates and cats and rodents and bats, were around 65 million years ago, or if there were still just a bunch of basal scurrying mammals running around, and that caused the vast adaptive radiation. But we didn't originate then. We are from much longer ago than that. But do you want to take the political question?
Yeah, I think, the political spectrum is a feature of a moment in time, but there is something, and we actually address this a bit in the book that we are currently writing and revising. There is a basic dichotomy between, let's say, stasis and progress, with progress being risky, but the mechanism that opens up what we call frontiers. So, yes, this will be a very ancient process, but I don't even think it's early mammals. We have made the argument that this is actually an evolutionary feature that will cover all taxa, even ones that don't have a cognitive capacity.
Even bacteria.
Yeah, that there is a tension between modes. And so anyway, we'll talk more about that at some other point. But yes, there is something to the idea that those kinds of divisions that we find in our cognitive political space actually have roots that go far back into our distant ancestral past.
What should the productive conversations of geometric unity theory look like, and what platforms would they live on?
Well,
I'm talking to the wrong brother.
Yeah, you got the wrong Weinstein. I don't know how to answer that question. I think the fact that we are talking about geometric unity in public is very healthy, and I look forward to seeing where it goes. But Eric, that's a question for you, clearly.
That's right. Your thoughts on a virtual convention on freedom and rights in light of the crisis. Oh, your thoughts on a virtual convention on freedom and rights in light of the crisis, and would you be interested in participating in such a conversation?
Yeah, I don't know that you even need the current crisis, and I will say that I think most of the people who were involved in conversations about how we might remake civilization productively were motivated by a fear of just how fragile our current civilization has become. And so
5-10 years ago. Long
Even
before the current
longer.
crisis, yes,
So-
but certainly long before right now.
yeah, so for some of us, I don't know anybody who saw the particulars of this crisis emerging as they did, but wow, there were a lot of us who were awfully nervous that people seem to have gotten complacent about the hazards we face, and the hazards were looming ever larger.
Salutations, super people. Thank you. There's been chatter on the philanthropic front lately about the possibility of COVID-related vaccination and surveillance campaigns. Gates seems enthusiastic, but I'm a little worried. Thoughts?
What could possibly go wrong?
What could possibly go wrong?
What could possibly go wrong?
That said, South Korea's track and trace requires, which has been by nearly everyone's measures, one of the most successful nation-state-wide measures to keep this under control, required targeted surveillance.
So I guess at the risk of destroying what we've built up here,
Good.
yeah, I would say, look, this is the wrong time to be having this discussion, and I understand that we have to have it because we're in this situation, but a lot of us have been shouting about the hazard of a government that appears to be functioning towards objectives that are not public-spirited, and the necessity of remaking it such that it is accountable, right? That is not a new topic for many of us. And so, yes, we are now in the situation where we both have to do some sort of track and trace thing, and the one entity that's really in a position to do it couldn't possibly be trusted. And even if you say, well, it could be done privately, you're going to do it through your phone? Is it going to be Google? I don't trust any of these entities to engage in this kind of behavior. So we're now damned if we do and damned if we don't. What we should do is recognize never again. We don't want to be in the situation. We need the ability to deploy some sort of track and trace in order to deal with the next epidemic without it inviting this kind of authoritarian overreach nonsense we've seen so much of. So let's fix this. And if we can't fix it for this round, let's fix it for the next one.
Good. A study shows SARS-2 attacks ACE2 in testes and reduces testosterone by 50% in recovered patients. Thoughts? Zach, you want to highlight that one because it's got a link in it?
I would say I
haven't seen. I feel like someone pointed this out to us before and we didn't pursue it.
Yeah. So
I just haven't seen the research.
we need to know
It's a huge reduction if that's true.
it's a huge reduction.
Huge.
We need to know what it means. Does this mean everybody who's had an asymptomatic case? I strongly doubt it. What it's going to mean is people who had a severe case, and is the result robust? I have my doubts about that too, but we could find out that it is. Is the result robust? But, nobody's had this disease for very long, so does it clear up
Does it
over the course
dissipate?
of a year?
Yeah,
In which case, let's not worry about it. If it
Yep.
doesn't clear up, over the course of time, then it raises questions. Obviously, testosterone is something you could supplement if you needed to. So anyway, I don't see it as the primary concern, and I'd like to know a lot more about it before saying anything definitive. But it's interesting.
That number 50 reduces testosterone by 50% in recovered patients strikes me as a red flag. It just seems so high.
Yeah.
But we'll take a look. Y'all have an email to send papers of interest to. We both have websites that have emails on them. I think it's support@bretweinstein.net.
Yep.
And hell if I remember what mine is. At heatherhying.com, maybe? I'm not sure. I'm sure about yours.
Yeah.
Thoughts on link between positive blood types and death rate. With a sample of 1,500, those with positive blood type... we're talking about rhesus factor then. Are up to 15% more likely to die from COVID-19. Interesting. We had seen the ABO blood type paper and talked about it in one of the early live streams, but I had not seen the rhesus factor one. So I don't have any particular
Yeah.
thoughts here.
So I would say this raises some questions for me, which may well be known to other people. But there's some question about why. So in mammals, red blood cells do not have a nucleus. The story that we tell about that is that the nucleus is removed so that there's more room for hemoglobin to carry oxygen. This raises all sorts of questions about why the virus is invading red blood cells to begin with, because absent a nucleus, is it able to do anything? My guess would be no, but I can't rule it out. I should have looked it up, but I can't rule it out without looking it up, because it's possible that when the nucleus is removed, ribosomes are left behind, in which case this particular virus could continue to operate in a red blood cell, in which case this would be straightforward. If that was not the case, which I assume it is not the case, I don't think there are ribosomes left behind in the red blood cell, but I don't know. If there are no ribosomes left behind in the red blood cells, then there's a question about why these antigens on the surface of the red blood cells are playing a primary role. Are those antigens also being seen somewhere else in the physiology? And so the red blood cells are a red herring in this case, or is there some meaning? The reason that the coronavirus looks the way it does is that it has these receptors on its surface which interact with the proteins on the surface of cells. And so getting into a cell is very frequently, and in this case, it is a matter of joining proteins on the surface of the cell and using them to, bind the membrane. So it has a cell-like membrane, the lipid membrane you've heard of, and spill its contents into the cytoplasm of the cell. So there's a question about whether that's happening in red blood cells. If so, why does the virus want in if it doesn't have ribosomes with which to make more virus? And I don't know the answers to those questions, but that's the road I would go down.
Here.
Cut off future specific cuts.
Okay, yeah. So we are going to stop taking super chat questions. Zach, you just want to draw a line on the spreadsheet if you can, so that we know where to stop, because we've got a lot more to get through here. And so I now can't see what the next question is, though. Let's see if I can find it on mine. Would you be interested in forming an alliance of professors in exile? Ape. Academic stakeholders like us will have more power to influence the academy as a group. Maybe?
Yeah, we're always open to these ideas, but we want to see something that has the potential to do the job.
Yep.
That's really crucial.
Yep. Hi, professors. Thank you for these streams. Bret, last week you said you were doubting the wet market origin story in favor of the virology lab. Can you discuss your reasons in more depth? Before you answer, though, you're saying virology lab accidental release rather than intentional bioweapon.
Just going to say that. I saw an appalling question, I think out of the Pew Research Center, then parroted by CNN, where some 30% of Americans believe the virus is architected in a lab. And I looked at this and I just thought, if I had been asked this question, the answer that I would give was not available, because I don't believe that this virus was engineered. We don't have evidence that I believe points in that direction. But there is reason to think that it was being investigated in a lab and that may have been how it was released. So
I don't think you spelled it out, though. The question, the question that you saw was A or B. Do you think this virus came out of a lab or not?
Do you think it's natural
Yeah.
or it was engineered in a lab?
Which is not a complete solution set.
Right. So what and I am open to all kinds of evidence for any other hypothesis, but from what I've seen so far, I would say I think it's a natural virus. I think it was in the lab potentially for legitimate reasons, could have been illegitimate reasons, but that what happened is a mistake in the lab caused someone to be infected, and that's a natural virus that has escaped through a lab. It's not A or B.
And why specifically are you doubting the wet market origin story?
I'm doubting the wet market origin because I have yet to see the evidence for a clear pattern that the wet market was involved. And,
They weren't selling bats. The closest colony of horseshoe bats is a long ways away.
Yep.
There was something else we were talking about last night.
So again, I don't want responsibility for this story. I don't know. I've never been to Wuhan. I don't know anything about their wet market, how it functions under normal circumstances. I don't know whether you can order bat soup in a restaurant in Wuhan. But what I have seen suggests that this is not common practice in that part of the world. The bats in question
What isn't? Eating bat soup isn't common practice.
isn't common practice there. There isn't, from what I understand, bats were not found for sale in the Wuhan market at the point that this was suspected.
The clade of bats, which are understood to be the source of the virus, the closest colony is at least 100 miles away, farther?
It's farther away than that, and that could be wrong. Maybe there's a cave I don't know about, but the evidence I saw suggested that. And on the other hand, I have seen what credibly appears to be a job advertisement to study bat coronaviruses at a lab that just happens to be in Wuhan. And so, where am I? I'm not committed to any hypothesis yet, but I would say the one hypothesis continues to look weaker the more I see, and the other hypothesis looks stronger. What doesn't look strong to me at all is the idea that this is an engineered virus.
Totally engineered.
At all engineered.
Yeah. Or, nor do we see, I think of either of us seen any compelling evidence that this was intentional release as a weapon.
It doesn't make sense to me that you would release it close to the virology lab because it raises too many questions. So,
Yep.
Everything I know so far suggests accidental release.
And that's not to say that there weren't lab safety issues, right? Perhaps more so in that lab than there should have been, that they could have foreseen problems and all. But this is always a risk when you are doing this kind of research in any lab, which exist probably in every major city on the planet at this point.
So I'm still very anti-wet market. I mean, we effectively know that HIV came from human contact with a hunted chimpanzee. Is that not enough of a cost for us to end the hunting of wild animals for the sale in wet markets? I think it's sufficient in and of itself.
Right. How much of a role do you think climate change has to play in increasing the likelihood of more zoonotic diseases jumping from wild animals to humans?
I hate to say it, but I think probably in the end it reduces the likelihood because it reduces diversity. I think it's just going to reduce the number of creatures we're interacting with.
So I think in the end, obviously climate change will reduce diversity, but it may put species in contact with one another sooner than they would have, or at all than they would have in the shorter term, such that you end up with a shorter term spike in zoonotic jumping between host species with a longer term decline because there's just not as many species to jump from.
Yeah, and it will also create desperate people who will eat bushmeat who wouldn't otherwise be driven to it.
Yep.
But I would say, as somebody who has handled wild mammals regularly in graduate school, I studied bats, I netted them, I took data and glued transmitters to them and let them go. I don't
And for
think...
no good scientific reason, you handled mouse lemurs.
Yeah. I had a good scientific reason. It's just a little hard to defend. But in any case... basic precautions in general have prevented this kind of transmission as far as we know. There's always the risk that something is going to jump. I think we need to think about how to deal with people who do what I did in graduate school, studying these animals. How do we make sure that, not releasing something into the human population is high on their list of concerns. But by and large, if something had a really easy time jumping to humans, it's already happened. And to the extent that things don't jump so easily to humans, then the point is we need to prevent intimate contact of the sort that butchering and cutting your finger or whatever it is that would cause that sets in motion. So anyway, I don't think it's a straightforward anthropogenic climate change increases or decreases.
Yeah,
I think it's going to be a bit of both.
Hello again. Do you think erythropoietin, EPO, would help with hypoxia and treating COVID-19 with the malaria drugs such as hydroxychloroquine? Thanks for all the insightful ideas to digest while in isolation. I don't know enough about EPO to address this.
I can't say. All I can say is what I said on the beginning of the live stream, which is that I've seen 2 papers this week that cast doubt on the idea of hydroxychloroquine being a useful treatment, at least for people who are already very sick.
Right.
That I believe was true in both papers.
Mm-hmm. Amazing work, folks. Keep it up. Thank you. Do you think the fact...
Sorry.
Where are we? There we go.
Yep.
Stop moving it for a second. No problem. Do you think the fact that China has controlled this virus with relative ease points to the possibility that this was a bioweapon, intentionally released? The Chinese government has certainly sacrificed more citizens before. Thanks. I don't think that we can believe that China has controlled this virus with relative ease. I don't think there's any reason to assume that the data coming out of China are real or accurate. That said, it's true that the Chinese government has demonstrated willingness to sacrifice citizens in ways that would be anathema to people of other nation states. But I don't think that there's any reason to trust the numbers coming out of China at this point.
Agreed.
Thank you for the intellectual, informative, and engaging broadcast. You're welcome. What's your EDC, your everyday carry, your wallet, keys, etc.?
Well, even though we're in lockdown, I still put on pants every day.
Every day.
For reasons I can't quite articulate.
And you're not going commando. You've got underwear and underneath.
Oh, yeah. No, the full thing. Everyday carry. I mean...
Well, mine's actually less. Like when if you're staying at home, you don't put on wallet and keys and such. But when I do have to go out, I now I strip down to a driver's license and a card and an insurance card and a single key and my phone so that I don't have to be playing with a lot of objects.
I now know what I was supposed to answer to this question.
Okay, can we start again? What's your EDC, your everyday carry, your wallet, keys, etc.?
When I go out, among the things that I do is I take my phone out of the case that I have it in at home. If I drop my phone, the case protects it from breaking. If I go out, I take it out of the case so that I can wash it when I get home or sanitize it while I'm out if I think it's been compromised, because I do find myself interacting with it,
Yeah.
but it's an obvious source of contagion. If, I touch an object at a store, I touch my phone, I want to be able to clean it. And so this puts the phone at risk, but I think it's worth it.
Yeah. And we've got sanitizer in the car and in the truck so that we have a way to clean stuff when we get back into the vehicle.
Yes, and modern phones can be washed under a faucet.
Yeah. But I mean, with regard to credit cards, keys, et cetera.
Yep, totally.
We now know an economic shutdown and curfews are not proportional to the actual danger of this virus. Whose head should roll first?
Wow. I don't think we know any such thing. And the problem is, to the extent that we've been effective at addressing this with lockdowns, we don't know what the world would have looked like otherwise. But if you missed our discussion of what happened in Guayaquil, Ecuador, I suggest you look into it, because this can get pretty frightening pretty quick. And, even with lockdown, we've got mass graves being dug in Potter's Field in New York. Now, that's for unclaimed bodies, but nonetheless, we have a body crisis in New York that's causing extraordinary measures. We saw an absolute catastrophe unfold in Guayaquil, Ecuador. I think we have enough evidence that very serious things occurred and that we hovered at the edge of something much worse that I am not prepared to say we overreacted at all. Quite the opposite.
Whenever public health measures work, it's easy for the people who didn't want them in place to say they were unnecessary.
Yep.
And this is forever a permanent problem of defending measures that were functional and effective.
Chesterton's lockdown.
All right, good.
All right.
Could the lack of positive tobacco research be caused by no funding after the MSA stopped big tobacco from funding research? I'm not sure what the MSA is. Do you know what the MSA is?
No. Can't figure it out.
So I think the idea of big tobacco funding research that's looking into whether or not tobacco is harmful might have decreased bad research for sure, but I think, in fact, there was a clear perverse incentive with having big tobacco funding research that is trying to discover whether or not tobacco is harmful or not. And when it's NIH or NSF, there are other issues with having these big governmental organizations basically being the gatekeepers for what questions you're allowed to ask. But the researchers in that case at least have no perverse incentive to find one way or the other. So you shouldn't find it being biased in the other direction just because the people with a clear bias are no longer allowed to fund research. Anything else?
Nope.
Okay. Libertarianism isn't insane, T. Bra says. It's a different form of societal optimization. Outside of its proper context, any optimization appears insane.
It's not a societal optimization. It's essentially the abdication of the attempt to reach societal optimization, or it is a misunderstanding of the game theory that would allow you to imagine that society full of people who are individually freed to do as they wish will optimize for the whole, which it won't. Now, that said, I take a very hard line with libertarians because I think they have something dead wrong, but I have also come to understand they have something dead right. And it would be very valuable if we could tease those two apart so we could recover the part of libertarianism that makes sense, which is to say liberty is a special virtue and one can reasonably seek to maximize it if one understands its true nature, rather than understanding you will maximize realized liberty by maximizing formal liberty. Maximizing formal liberty results in needless failures. And so let's please level up and tease these two things apart so that we can stop making the same errors over and over again.
Very good. Research question. Is COVID-19 a planned, implemented, and managed global pandemic by orgs using PR tactics to gain compliance regarding immunization and every person digital tagging? A World Health Order.
Can I take that one?
Yeah, go for it.
I don't believe we have any evidence to suggest that it is. However, the instinct of those authoritarian entities to take advantage of a crisis to advance their ball is essentially certain. We're already seeing it at a legislative level. And we have to be very concerned. And I have to say this is one of many reasons that I'm very unhappy with the Democratic Party's choice to rally around Joe Biden, because as I understand it, Joe Biden was actually the author of a prototype bill for the Patriot Act, which emerged in the crisis of 9/11. So anyway, yes, we have a problem, but that doesn't mean that the crisis was orchestrated in order to advance these things. Much more likely that this is just opportunistic overreach.
There it is. Opportunistic overreach. Maasai tribal wisdom states, although washing your hands in cow urine won't kill viruses, it will encourage you to not touch your face.
And you
Well done.
just won the podcast.
Very good. There are solitary sawflies, bees, and wasps. So are there solitary ants? And if not, why not? There are.
Well,
I mean, I guess,
and no.
yeah, yes and no. There are ants like the bala ant that forage solitarily, but they go back to homes with lots of big, scary homes, lots of scary bala
in
ants.
fact, permit me.
Oh, you don't have bullet ants in the studio, do you?
do. I have one solitary bullet
Oh my goodness. Okay. In a lucite ice cube.
In a lucite ice cube that I made back when I was a graduate student experimenting with lucite. So anyway, this is an ant. You can't really see it. It has wings. It's a reproductive ant, and it is of a species that we have encountered
this is
regularly.
Paraponera?
Yep, this is Paraponera.
Oh my goodness.
So this is a giant
That is a
ant
terrifying ant.
that forages solitarily, but they do live in colonies, so it's not truly solitary. I think the answer to your question is
I don't think I think maybe there aren't any then that are entirely solitary.
yeah.
Is that right?
I think that's right. But we're going to find out because
Yes.
somebody will correct us
we
if
certainly
we're
are.
not correct.
Yeah, and if not, why not? Like what makes ants different? I'm trying to remember with regard to the phylogeny of the Hymenoptera. Are ants basal? I mean, bees and wasps certainly are sister, but I don't remember. I don't remember how it falls out and where the sawflies are because I think they're Hymenopterans, but they're like maybe they're the most basal. I don't know. I don't know how it falls out.
Yeah, I don't either. I seem to recall wasps were basal, but maybe that's wrong.
It feels, I don't know.
Jack, we need your help.
Yeah, that's right. We know an ant guy.
Yeah.
He's probably not watching. Thanks to the three of you. These are so great. Could you do my job for me? This is the Steelman podcast. Could you do my job for me? And Steelman, social media, our ability to coordinate solutions, disseminate critical info, expose faux expertise. It's not without faults, but... So
I mean, didn't you just do it?
yeah, kind of.
Social media. Well, I mean, look, it's the same thing over and over again. It's not the box, it's the business model. That's what I used to say about television. And lo and behold, things like HBO proved that. That's not to say HBO is flawless, but it's to say that when you liberate television from a model where it has to keep you in your seat between commercial breaks, it produces a much higher quality good. Social media absolutely sucks. Why? Because of the nature of the corporations that deploy it in the market and their obligations in general to their shareholders, but to their owners in any case. That can't possibly go well. Same thing goes for your cell phone. These things are all potentially fantastic technologies that are hamstrung by the way they are plugged into the market. And unfortunately, because they belong to these Goliath-like corporate entities, we can't replace them with something that would do the job that's positive without being predatory. And that's really the predicament we're stuck in. What we need is the phone and the social media platform that actually has our interests at heart, and we just can't get there from here.
Have really enjoyed these streams. Thanks. I'm curious about the skull on the desk.
Aw. Yeah. The skull on the desk is now you've done it. Okay. That is a seal skull that I acquired from a seal who
was no longer using it.
He was no longer using it, especially as I disassociated it from him, and that made it impossible to use it. But he had actually died of presumably natural causes and washed up on a beach in Oregon where I violated the law by removing his head with a knife that was way too short for the job. I did this in the headlight of a pickup truck driven by a student friend of mine who had found the animal. And it caused quite a kerfuffle on the field trip that I was on, where many people had a moral objection to my having recovered the head of this animal for the purpose of generating this beautiful skull, even though
And at
none of
least
them...
some people had a legal objection, understanding that you had in fact broken the law.
Yeah, I mean, I guess. But the discussion was an interesting one because lots of people found what I did distasteful, even though they had a hard time putting their finger on exactly what the problem was. Now, it turns out that what I had engaged in was actually kind of dangerous behavior because there are a lot of things you can get from a sea mammal like this one.
Diseases?
Yeah. You can get
Pathogens from sea
infection-
mammals?
Oh, yeah, bad ones. So anyway, I got lucky. I got this fancy skull here. It has served me well. I've demonstrated to many classes how the skull of a seal looks just like the skull of a bear, except for the teeth, and there's a reason for that, which is that as far as we understand it, seals are actually bears. And if that sounds like a preposterous statement, then allow me to defend it to you at some point, because it's literally true.
Somewhere around here we have a bear skull from Alaska as well.
It's downstairs.
We can put
Maybe
them
we'll
next to
bring
each
it in
other.
next time.
Yeah. Please explain your objection to the lesser of two evils calculation. How is Biden not preferable to Trump?
Well, yeah, we're going to have to go deeper into this later, but let me just say this. My objection to the lesser evil paradigm is twofold. One, it doesn't hold up if you think about elections as an iterated phenomenon. In other words, it requires us to think about elections individually and then say, well, okay, they may both suck, but this one sucks less. Obviously, you're going to vote for them, right? On the other hand, if the point is actually, no, my objective is that humans are still on this planet 500 years from now, and I think both of these guys leave the basic problem intact, and therefore I'm looking for whatever solution gets us through that bottleneck, it's a very different question. So that's the primary objection. The secondary objection is that things like the Democratic National Committee have used the lesser evil paradigm in order to keep us trapped and not cater to the interests of the public. So having abandoned the interests of working people decades ago, the way they keep us from fleeing the party in favor of some alternative has to do with the fact that all they have to do is deliver something that at the particular cocktail parties we go to is treated as a lesser evil, and we will be hamstrung and we will just simply roll our eyes and vote for their person one more time. And at some point, when somebody uses that mechanism to control you, you have to not do what they're expecting.
So lots more to say, but for
Yeah.
another time. Which organisms follow us in a consciousness scale? Not sure what follow us means.
You mean, they want who is next most conscious? This is an easy one, I think. It's dogs. That is domestic dogs. And not incidentally. It is a result of their coevolution with us. So that's, I realize, a paradoxical
That's
answer.
cool. Maybe we should just leave it, leave that answer there for further exploration another time, but also say those organisms that are long-lived, social with generational overlap and have long childhoods tend to be more conscious than not. So you can fill in the gaps. It's the other great apes. It's many monkeys. It's dolphins. Elephants and wolves and parrots and crows and many others. But
all toothed whales, not just dolphins. But yeah, those other critters are high on the list too.
Is the dogma of original sin an example of your factually false, metaphorically true? And could utopianism be a pitfall that it is attempting to avoid?
Trying to parse that one. Obviously, original sin would be a literally false, metaphorically true idea. How it functions, I don't know. We could make several arguments. Could utopianism be a pit? I think utopianism is just it's a response to an overly reductive understanding of improvement. And the fact is, utopians create disasters because they see one thing that they want to fix and they focus on it without understanding trade-offs. It's as simple as that. So,
And it assumes a static world.
yep.
Thoughts whether male homosexual preference is caused by a pathogen. It's too common to be mutational pressure. Identical twins are usually discordant 75% of the time. It's hell on fitness, not found in hunter-gatherers.
Nope. It's an adaptation.
Yep, just
Yep.
leave it there.
Leave it there.
We can
I
go back to it.
recognize you're probably screaming at your screen now. It can't be an adaptation because how would it be passed on? We'll get there.
Is it crazy to be fearful of the idea of forced vaccination? My girlfriend suggests it's crazy, but I think it's reasonable to be fearful of the idea of forced vaccination. Yeah, this is hard.
It's not crazy to be fearful.
Yeah.
Is there a circumstance in which it would be necessary to force vaccination and you would have to overcome your fears? I think there are rational places where that could well emerge, but
Figuring out where that line is really, really hard.
yes, and I think we've done a terrible job. Our safety system is so broken that to force people to vaccinate would be reasonable if the vaccines were so safe that for the benefit to the herd of producing the immunity, it was necessary to require it. But that puts the burden on the system to make the things very, very, very safe. And the problem is the economic model doesn't support it. So anyway, as I have said elsewhere, we have vaccinated our children. We are strong believers in the importance of vaccines, but we are, I'll speak for me. I am livid that we have been as cavalier about drug safety and medical procedure safety as we have been. And if you want me to become an enthusiastic advocate for things like mandatory vaccination, then you got to make these things safe.
Good. Can you talk about viral exanthems and COVID-19? I had chickenpox as a child, but I recently was diagnosed with it again mid-March after traveling to Western Asia. More likely to be COVID or chickenpox? Boy, I wouldn't think those two things would look like the same at all.
Yeah, I don't know. Chickenpox is fascinating. It is a virus that goes latent inside of people who've been exposed. So there are many possibilities. It's possible you encountered a strain that was far enough from the one that you had before, and so were capable of being infected. Also, possible it was COVID. Who knows?
Yep. Okay, 3 more questions. I'm going to go bottom to top here.
Okay.
Would you like to discuss decentralized legislatures on your show? The null hypothesis of politics.com.
Decentralized legislatures. I've encountered other potential solutions to what that must be a response to, but decentralized legislature is not, I can't even quite tell what it would be. I mean, in some sense, we have a decentralized legislature by virtue of the fact that it is sourcing people from all over the country and compiling them in a, so.
He's given us a link to
Yep.
learn more, maybe. From my research, most vaccines are manufactured using animal tissues and may therefore introduce animal-based virus to humans. If vaccine science, controls, and quality are as safe as possible, why should manufacturers receive immunity?
This is a can of worms, to be sure,
Oh, immunity from
being sued,
Yeah,
presumably. Here's the reason. I think we have to steelman it before we attack it. The reason is because if we need vaccines produced, then we cannot leave those that we are asking to produce them in the frightening position of being sued over things they could not reasonably have foreseen. And the very fact that we say, well, you're making it with animal tissue, therefore something could jump, that's on you, might drive everybody out of the race to produce these things. So there's an argument for it. But what I would say is it isn't clear to me at all, and I rather suspect otherwise, that the production of these things for profit is a bad idea. And so there's a question about whether or not you want to generate a public effort to create the vaccines that would not have the same fears or incentives and then could render them as safe as possible, which is really, I think, the ideal solution, which is where all the libertarians who follow us will now be apoplectic because I've advocated government doing something that we don't want government ineptitude compromising. But the point is, what we need is higher quality government, and I do believe that's possible.
Final question. Can you talk more about rent-seeking?
Sure. Rent-seeking effectively is the utilization of a bottleneck to recover profits that are the result of non-productive behavior in the market. And my contention is that we tend to imagine, based on what we've all been taught from classical economics, that rent-seeking exists, but that it is a small perturbation on a system that by and large functions as the textbook says. And the more I think about it, and the more I read, the more I discover that rent-seeking may in fact be an ever larger fraction of the economy, and that it would become so as a result of what we would call the adaptive landscape of opportunities that the market provides. In other words, this is not the result of evil people. It's not that you're born a rent seeker, but everybody is looking for opportunities to profit in the market. And the question is, do they have good opportunities that don't involve rent seeking? And if they didn't have good opportunities, but they did have rent seeking opportunities, wouldn't you expect them to discover that? And anybody who opted not to would be leaving the door open to anybody who would. So we would expect to see the growth of rent seeking operations anywhere and everywhere it's possible. So in any case, rent seeking is a huge problem. It is a doubly huge problem when you have governmental corruption built into your structures as we do, because those who make their profit through rent seeking, and it's not that these people are inherently rent seekers. It may be that you've got people who have been very productive and 20% of their fortune is the result of productivity and 80% of their fortune is the result of rent seeking. They probably don't even know the difference. So the problem is when rent seeking produces profits, and profits produces political power through some sort of corruption, very often legal but immoral, then what you get is a system that becomes built around protecting the interests of rent seekers. And that's where we find ourselves. So let's fix it.
I think the last question
That's
is
it.
because of delay from within that time.
Okay. We got one more question then.
All right.
For Bret, are we experiencing some sort of social collapse in the West? It may be a bias on my part, but we seem to be moving inexorably towards some climax socially, geopolitically, and economically.
I would say we are experiencing a gentle apocalypse.
Which I'm calling it the rolling apocalypse.
The rolling apocalypse, all right. It's a mild apocalypse. Yes, we are, if you read our upcoming book, you will find us discussing the meaning of close calls. What this is actually an almost ideal close call for us to understand almost everything that's wrong with our system, so that when this happens again next time, we can't say this caught us off guard. So my hope here is that this is mild enough that we get through it without a major depression, without massive quantities of deaths, all of those things. But I certainly hope that it leaves an indelible mark and that it puts an end to certain childish, nonsensical notions about how things have never been better. Because, things have never been better at one level, and they've never been more dangerous at the very same time. So here we are.
Great place to end.
All right.
Yeah.
Well, it's been great. We will see you next time, which, if everything goes according to plan, will be
Friday.
All right. Be well, stay safe, and we'll see you Friday.